Welcome to Simply by DealHQ. On this podcast, we engage thought leaders on topical issues around law and business in the most simplistic manner.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 6 of Simply by DealHQ. On this episode, we'll be discussing the role of intellectual property rights and its importance to startups. We'll be assessing the need for a strong IP portfolio as a way to attract investors and increase the potential for a successful capital raise. Over the past decade, Nigeria has experienced a boom in tech-driven startups, particularly in the fintech, e-commerce, and logistics sectors. According to Disrupt Africa, the Nigerian startup ecosystem saw over $1.5 billion in investments in 2021 alone, making it one of the most sought-after markets for venture capital in Africa. This wave of investments, coupled with an increasingly digital-savvy population, has paved the way for startups to grow into multi-million and even billion-dollar companies. Embedded in the growth of these startups is the evolving awareness of the importance of intellectual property rights and its potential to act as an instrument for increasing capital raise and also being a source of revenue on its own. Today, we'll be joined by our esteemed guests to discuss, amongst other things, the concept of intellectual property, the potential of having a strong IP portfolio in a capital raise, the contribution of a strong IP portfolio in the valuation of a startup, and the regulatory framework for startups and intellectual property in Nigeria. Our esteemed guest, Ms. Precious Ossi, is an associate in the DealHQ Partners Technovation team. Thank you so much for joining us, Precious.
Thank you so much for having me.
So now that we're done with our introductions, permit me to jump right into my first question. One of our objectives here on Simply is to simplify complex concepts for the benefit of our listeners. So Precious, can you please provide an overview on what intellectual property is, the concept of intellectual property rights, and what a startup is, particularly how intellectual property fits into the conversation of startups?
Okay, thank you so much once again for having me. All right, so to jump right into your question, an overview of intellectual property. Intellectual property basically refers to the intangible proprietary asset that is created by the works of the human mind. So we mean creations of the mind, such as innovations, inventions, designs, symbols, names, literary and artistic works, and all of that. So the basic consideration is the originality and the novelty of these creations. That means the creation must be new, the invention must be fresh and born out of inventive results of independent creative efforts. And the work must also be distinct from existing works, and it must demonstrate a certain degree of creativity. All right, so that is basically what intellectual property is. I must note that intellectual property in itself is not a right. Like we've already established, intellectual property is the invention, the new product, the process, the methods, the literary work, artistic work, the music, the picture, and all of that. However, the right is what is granted by law to the owner or the creator of this invention. Okay, so the intellectual property rights would basically be the patents that are granted for innovations, inventions, trademarks that are granted for symbols, logos, brand identity, copyrights that are granted for literary, music, and artistic works, industrial designs for product designs, and all of that. We also have other kinds of intellectual property rights like trade secrets that is not necessarily protected by law. That is confidential information of a business. And then we have others like geographical indication and protection of plant varieties. Okay, a startup is a newly formed business. It's a business that is still trying to grow, a business that just started, typically with innovative ideas, products, services, and seeking growth and scalability. So how does IP come into this conversation? At the point where a business is still starting, they might not have the tangible assets that the bigger businesses have. They might not have the money, they might not have property, physical properties, But what they would always have is their intellectual property. They would always have the ideas on which the business was founded, the products, the designs, or whatever it is that they intend to do would always be theirs to hold on to. So it is at this point that the intellectual property and the rights, the protection of those properties comes into the conversation. Because a startup would want to protect their innovative ideas and products. They won't want to come into the market and without a certain hold on what they have as their business, because that's going to give it the opportunity for others in the market to steal their ideas. They would also want to establish an identity. They will want to be recognized in the market. So many industries are already oversaturated, but with the rights, intellectual property, when it's protected, they are able to hold onto their identity and have a certain niche in the market for themselves. They're able to create a competitive advantage, because by the time you bring in something new, innovative that belongs to you, at least for a period of time, no other person can remake, you'd have a competitive advantage over other people that are already in the market. And startups are also able to attract investors, attract funding from other people that see the idea and love the idea because they see potentials in it. Basically, yes, those are ways that the IP comes into the startup conversation.
All right, thank you so much for that answer, Precious. I think it was very succinct. According to a 2019 EPO EU IPO study, it was demonstrated that small medium enterprises that have at least one IP right are 21% more likely to experience a growth period. So my question then is, in your opinion, how crucial do you think having IP rights are to the growth of a startup? Also, what intellectual property rights do you think a startup should look to have in building a strong IP portfolio? And finally, how early should a startup begin considering intellectual property rights protection?
Okay, all right. So I think that intellectual property rights are very, very crucial to every startup. Every company, every startup has intellectual property. The protection of that intellectual property is very, very important, because one cannot say they have something if they are unable to defend it if the need arises. So he also asked, what intellectual property rights do I think startups should look to have, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
startups should look to have every type of intellectual property right basically that could fall under whatsoever industry their business is in. So we're talking about patents for innovations that they make. They produce a product or they have a new method of doing something, they can go ahead to protect it by patents, trademarks for their brand names, brand logos, slogans, and all of that. Copyrights where they have written works, where they have artistic work, software, literary work, pictures, photographs, and all of that. Trade secrets, because every business must have its own confidential information. They must have something that they do that is not open to the public that makes them different. So trade secrets, the IPs would also be looking at industrial designs. If they are creating a product that has a unique design to it that is not somewhere in the market, they should also be looking at protecting their designs. So those are the kind of IP rights that startups should look. There are so many types of rights, but what matters is the industry that the IP, that the startup is in. Okay, so the consideration of intellectual property rights should start as early as possible, right from the ideation stage of every business, before the business is brought to the public. When the founders are still sitting down to think about how they want to come into the market, the consideration of intellectual property should have already started. They should have already marked out what makes us different in the market. What products are we coming up with? Is it already in the market? What is our brand going to look like? How do we protect our brand identity? This conversation should start from the very beginning, even before the market knows about it. Another point is where a new product will be launched. Take, for instance, a business that is already in operation and they want to release a new product. They want to come into the market with something new. At that point, intellectual property should be considered. so that they don't come into the market and expose their idea and then they have other people stealing it without them even enjoying some certain benefits as being the creators in the very first place. So also when they are trying to create a unique branding or design, startups should think about intellectual property. The main point is as early as possible before coming out to the open to reveal anything, the conversation of intellectual property and its protection should have already been had.
So we've come to realize that we have currently we have over 300 accelerators, syndicates, angel investors, micro VCs, venture capital, as well as private equity funds looking to invest in Nigerian startups with a ticket size ranging from $25,000 to up to $25 million. So what this does is that it underscores the potential for capital raised by startups in Nigeria. So my question then is, do you think that intellectual property plays a role in attracting investors? Also, do you think that a strong IP protection can influence investor confidence during a capital raise? And at the same time, are investors more likely to invest in startups with a solid IP portfolio, and why?
Okay, yes, I think intellectual property plays a very significant role in attracting investors and influencing their confidence during capital raises. All right, so yes, I think intellectual property plays a very significant role in attracting investors and influencing their confidence during capital raises. I also think that investors are more likely to invest in startups with solid IP portfolio. Okay, so like we've earlier said, these startups might not have not been in the market for so long. They might not have tangible assets. They might not have things to actually hold on to. Aside their intellectual property, most times people are coming to pitch businesses. They're talking about they're talking about things that they think their business can achieve in the future, and they have this projection because of what the products that they have at hand. Investors are looking at this because this is how you create a unique selling proposition. So by the time you have good intellectual property that is protected, you're already demonstrating to the investor that you know what you're doing. You are already being proactive. You know what your product can do in the future. You're not giving the opportunity for any kind of infringement, litigation, or anything like that. You're trying to explore all the edges of your business. And these are the kind of things that investors are looking out for. So it's showing them that your business actually has potential of generating revenue sometime in the future, even if not now. And then it's also showing your investors or whoever it is that you're pitching to that you are most likely to dominate the market because you have come out with something that is not there, and then you have even taken the steps to protect it for yourself, at least for a certain period of time. So yes, I think that intellectual property very well does attract investors, and it influences their confidence when trying to invest or raise capital for a startup.
So as of 2024, Flutterwave holds the title of the biggest or the highest valued startup in Nigeria with a market valuation exceeding $3 billion. Similar to Flutterwave, we also have startups such as InterSwitch, OPay, and Della, all of which have a valuation of over $1 billion. So my question then is, do you think that a solid IP portfolio contributes to the valuation of a startup in a capital raise? And in what ways can a well-protected IP portfolio contribute to the startup valuation, particularly when raising capital?
Okay. All right. So yes, like I earlier said, I think that a solid IP portfolio contributes significantly to during the startup, the capital raise for a startup. This is because, like I already said, the intellectual property assets that a startup has would show its level of innovation and its distinctiveness in the market. So it serves as a key differentiator to every investor and potential partner, especially, like I said, in the stage where there are no other kind of assets to hold on to. So we know that investors are always searching for potential returns, high returns on investments, and all of that. So by the time they are able to recognize intellectual property assets, and they are able to see that this is very valuable and it can break into the market, it can stand in the market, and they see that it's very viable, investors are able to go on. Okay, so this potentially increases the valuation of a company compared to another startup that doesn't really have something to bring to the table. You're coming into the market with something that is already there. What exactly should your investor hold on to? What is going to make you stand out in the market? So you can't come to you can't try to say you are what you are not, or try to claim a higher price, because they are already seeing this thing. And then what makes you different from the people in the market? But by the time you have a very solid intellectual property portfolio, and it's very visible to every eye that sees it, that this is something that can sell in the market, definitely the value of the business is going to rise. And then also because by the time you have protected your intellectual property, your investors are seeing that, okay, there might be no litigation here. You might not have any reason to spend time in the courts or trying to send out cease and desist letters to people to say, okay, I created this first, stop infringing on it, because you have already taken the steps to protect it. And then you've made it known to the public that this intellectual property has been protected by me. Nobody wants to spend their time on a lawsuit. So these are the kind of things that would actually increase the valuation, unlike any startup that leaves their intellectual property open to the public. A well-protected intellectual property has more value.
That leads me to my next question, right? And what we see is that every year companies lose about $17 million to IP valuations, right? And more than 10% of these infringements were committed via social media. What we've come to understand is that there is a need to protect intellectual property rights, particularly in this digital age. So my question then is, in your opinion, what IP strategies should startups adopt to ensure their intellectual property is safeguarded before they even begin to seek funding? Also, what challenges do you think that startups face in the protection of their intellectual property?
Okay, so strategies I think that startups can take before they even come to the public includes, okay, they can conduct IP audits to allow them identify, catalog their assets, because some of these startups have assets that they don't even know are assets. They have properties that they don't even know they can leverage on. But by the time they are able to involve a professional and conduct an audit, catalog these assets, add values to it, they are able to maximize and optimize the value of that particular intellectual property. I also think that startups should try from the very beginning to develop an intellectual property strategy. So they are having a framework that says that the moment that sets out time frame between when they should try to protect an intellectual property the moment it comes. They're not leaving any table unturned, any stone unturned. So they, from the very beginning, they are already having their strategy as to once a product is released, the first thing to do is to protect it. Once a new method is discovered, we have to take so step. They're already being very proactive from the beginning. That is another strategy. And then coming to the registration and the protection of these intellectual properties, it is one thing to identify them, it is one thing to create a strategy, and then it's another thing to actually protect those intellectual properties. Like I earlier said, you can't lay a claim on something if you don't have the right to. So aside copyrights that already exist from the point of its creation, almost every other intellectual property right must be protected. So startups from the very beginning, from the point of creation, should take the step to file for protection of their intellectual property. They should file for the protection of their trademarks, their patents, their designs, and all of that. And then another strategy is to ensure that they protect their trade secrets. So like we said, trade secrets is not protected under the law, particularly the way the copyrights, trademarks, designs, patents are protected. For trade secrets, it is the startup that would take the initiative by themselves to ensure adequate protection. So startups should sign non-disclosure agreements, they should sign non-circumventions, non-use with employers, with partners, with whoever it is that they are pitching their product to, just to stop them from trying to steal their idea, from remaking, reusing, or whatever. And just so that by the time they go ahead to do this, if they do, the startup has a ground to say, okay, you signed this agreement with us and you went ahead to infringe on our rights. So they should ensure they protect their trade secrets with their employer, their employees and partners and whosoever it is that they are exposing their confidential information to. And then another thing to do is to monitor and enforce the IP rights. So they have registered, they have taken the steps to register and protect. They are also supposed to monitor to be sure that somewhere someone is not infringing on their rights. They are supposed to keep a watchful eye on it. And then at any point where there is an infringement, they're supposed to take the step to enforce it or to at least shut down whatsoever is causing the infringement. And then this is also creates deterrence for other people so that those that are watching would see that, okay, this particular company takes their intellectual property seriously, and then they know that there is a line that should not be crossed. And then the points of education, awareness creating can never be overstated. They should continue to create to create classes, courses, training sessions for their employees, their staff, and all of that, so that everybody is aware of what the intellectual property is and the duty they have to protect it. And then what happens if at any point they infringe. And then lastly, you also asked what challenges I think startups face in the protection of their intellectual property. Startups face a whole lot of challenges, from limited resources, that is financial constraints that they might have. They might not have the ability to go ahead to protect their intellectual property, to file for the protection of their designs and trademarks. That is one challenge. There's also the challenge of globalization. There's also the challenge of digital infringement. A lot is happening on the social media, online marketing space, and all of that. We see so many forms of infringement, and then it just ends up discouraging the owners of this intellectual property from going ahead, because how many people do you want to fight? So these are the challenges that they face. There's a challenge that employees bring, because so many times we see trade secrets exposed. It is because of one employee that has gone out to expose the confidential information of the startup. Okay, and then we also have the problem of regulations. So the laws are there, but not necessarily to the extent to which they should actually protect the intellectual property. So people find it very difficult knowing what law should I hold on to. My intellectual property has been infringed. What should I do? Which body should I go to? So there are so many bodies that are there for different types of intellectual property. When someone has a problem with their copyrights, they're trying to run to the NCC. When they have a problem with trademarks, they're trying to run here and there. So laws and regulatory bodies are so decentralized that it is causing a challenge. So these are several challenges, and there's so many other challenges that startups face trying to protect their intellectual property.
All right, thank you once again, Precious, for that answer. Now, I'll move on to my next question. In the course of my research, we found that there has been an increased recognition and commercialization of IP assets in recent times. So IP commercialization simply refers to the act of using intellectual property to generate revenue. So my question is quite simple here, and I just want to know, what are some of the options that startups can explore in commercializing their IP assets in order to raise capital?
Okay, so to raise capital, startups can consider licensing their intellectual property. So this is by granting permission to others to use their intellectual property to remake, to distribute their intellectual property, such as their patents, their trademarks, copyrights, and all of that. So licensing, it can either be an exclusive license where they grant the permission to a sole person, a sole user, to use their intellectual property. It can be a non-exclusive license where the holder of the right allows multiple parties to use their intellectual property. It can be royalty-based, where they pay royalties on sale or usage. So they don't particularly give them a license, but when you use, you pay a certain amount. And then it can be a flat free license where you pay a one-time fee and then you don't have to keep renewing your license. So these are ways that this is one way a startup can generate capital by licensing their intellectual property to others to use and give them back some sort of payment for it. And then another way is by assignment or sale. So just like a property, just like any other property that can be sold, intellectual property can also be sold. The holder of a right can assign that right to another person, to a third party, at a fee or whatever is discussed between the parties. They can sell their patents, their trademarks, their copyrights to another person, and then this transfers all the rights that exists in that IP to the third party. And then another option that can be explored is IP-based financing. So a startup can request a loan and use their intellectual property as a collateral. This is not really done. This is not done so much in Nigeria because maybe because the intellectual property conversation hasn't really taken its peak in Nigeria, but it's something that can be done. Intellectual property can be used as a collateral for loan. It can also be just the way that properties can be used to buy shares in a company and all of that. Intellectual property can also be used for equity financing. However, the conversation of a valuer would come in here. All right. So another way is by entering into partnerships, joint ventures, and then sharing revenue. So a startup can collaborate with another startup, other companies to develop intellectual property, and they co-own and they share revenue. All right. They can also merge with other partners, and then they now share the profits and whatsoever. And then another way is by offering IP-based services. So, and a startup can definitely decide to start to offer consulting services, research services, and all of that. They can also start to create softwares, hardwares, or whatsoever products it is that are IP-based for sale to other people that might need same. Okay, so these are different ways that a startup can commercialize intellectual property.
All right, thank you once again, Precious, for that answer. And I think that the conversation around IP commercialization just drives home the point that IP can also act as a source of revenue in addition to being attractive for capital raise. So my
Yes.
next question now is around the regulatory framework.
Okay.
And so on the 17th of March 2023, the former President Mohamed Buhari signed the Copyright Bill 2022, now referred to as the Copyright Act, into law. And prior to this, we had the Startup Act of 2022, which was enacted into law to provide a framework for the development of startups in Nigeria and enabling environments for the establishment, development, and operation of startups in Nigeria, and also to position Nigeria's startup ecosystem as the leading digital technology center in Africa. So my question then is this. In your opinion, do you think that the Nigerian regulatory framework regarding intellectual property is well positioned to support the protection of intellectual property rights in Nigeria? Also, what more can be done from a regulatory perspective to ensure the protection of intellectual property rights as well as support the growth of startups?
Okay. All right. So first of all, I would like to not downplay the efforts of Nigeria. I think that they have taken significant steps to ensure the protection of intellectual property rights. I say this because formerly, it used to be as if the idea of protection of intellectual property was wishful thinking because we had laws, but those laws did not cover certain issues. So they were the issues of software, the internet, privacy, competition, and all of that. For instance, with the previous Copyright Act, the act stated what should happen when someone reproduces or sells a book physically without the authorization of the owner. But it never mentioned anything about what should happen if the infringement is on the internet, which continued to happen on an increasingly rate. So we see that so many people are copying and uploading books that do not even belong to them without the authorization of the owner, and then nothing could have been done previously. And then some other shortfalls of the previous laws were like the penal awards, where there is an infringement, the law would only impose a fine of about 100 naira to 1,000 naira, or for 5 years in prison and things like that. So these were shortfalls of the laws, but currently I think we're in a better place now. However, we are not there yet, but we are making good steps towards where we should be. So the lawmakers have taken significant steps. They've signed in the startup bill that provides a framework for development of startups in Nigeria. Okay. We also have the National Intellectual Property Policy and Strategy of 2022, which was brought in to strengthen the legal framework and enhance technology transfer, promote intellectual property awareness across the country. And of course, we have the Copyright Act of 2022 that came in with several improvements. Okay, so like I said, the previous one did not mention what should be done when infringement is digital. However, with the new Copyright Act, where there is an online infringement, there is now a punishment. So the holder can go ahead to protect their intellectual property online to avoid bypassing and all of that. And then the law gives them the right to request the service provider to take down the infringing article or whatsoever it is from the internet and all of that. So I must also say that the new Copyright Act increased the threshold of the sanction. So now we have punishments as we have fines as high as 1 million naira, or an imprisonment of 5 years term and all of that. The new act also allows for the protection of audiovisual works and performance rights. So these are notable points of growth in the Nigerian intellectual property regulatory system. However, I think that more can be done to ensure the protection of intellectual property rights and to support startup growth. Okay, so I think Nigeria should look more into enforcement to strengthen the enforcement of these laws, because we know that the laws are here now. However, enforcement becomes an issue. I also think that capacity building, because capacity building is something that we should invest in, because there is still the problem of lack of awareness. People are not aware of their intellectual property rights. They don't know what this thing is. They don't know how it exists. They don't know how to go ahead to protect it. So providing trainings, education programs for the masses, for professionals who can now go ahead to disseminate to the masses and all of that is something that should be done. I also think that state level adoption is also something that should be considered. So we have these laws, we have these acts on the federal level, but it should be broken down, and then states should also adopt, so that from the littlest points, from the grassroots, there is some sort of implementation before it even gets to the point of the federation. And then there is also the need for harmonization of intellectual property laws. So we have so many laws, that cover intellectual property, but they are in different sectors. We have the Copyright Act, the Trademarks Act, Patents and Designs Act, Merchandise Act, we have the Industrial Designs Regulation, Startup Act. There are just so many laws, so many regulatory bodies that have one thing or the other to do with the protection of intellectual property. The NOTAB is there for technology. We have so many bodies. I think that it is a problem. There might be a need to harmonize these laws, harmonize regulatory body, or at least have one regulatory body that oversees the activities of the others, so that at the very least, someone can go to a particular head body, and then that person can direct that body can direct them to other subs for particular to deal with whatever issue that they might have. It's a very big problem because take for instance, the CAC is registering companies, the trademark the IPO body is registering trademarks, and we see so many instances where a name is registered by one company, another company registers a logo with that particular name or a slogan with that particular name, and this is happening because there is no unified system between the both bodies. So things that have to do with brand identity becomes a problem. Someone has registered a business name, and then someone else somewhere has registered a logo that is very similar to that business name. So where exactly does the protection come in? Can I go and fight with the CAMA, or should I go and fight with the Trademark Act? So these are problems. So there is a need to harmonize the laws. And then lastly, there are so many international corporations that I think Nigeria should become a member of. So it's not just about signing the treaty, it's about ratifying those agreements so that they can actually become laws in Nigeria. Nigeria is party to so many, signatory to so many treaties, but at the end, they are not operating in the country because it has not been ratified into the Nigerian law. So that is a problem. Nigerians can protect their intellectual property within Nigeria, but then by the time they want to start talking about going global, it becomes a problem because except they go to those particular countries, there may not really be a way to make one registration that somehow affects those other countries. So Nigeria should consider being parties to the Madrid system for trademarks, the Lisbon system, and all of these. There are so many international cooperation treaties that Nigeria should consider being party to so that we are not just protected in Nigeria, but we are afforded some level of protection outside Nigeria.
So that leads me to my final question. Now, looking ahead, how do you see the role of intellectual property rights evolving in the world of startup funding? Also, how can startup founders and investors be more aware of the role of intellectual property rights in enhancing the growth of startups?
Okay, so I think that the role of intellectual property is only going to continue to get bigger and greater by the day because people now are starting to realize what this thing is and how much value it can actually add to their business. So it's only going to evolve, it's only going to become something of so much importance in the nearest future. So with the current, especially with the current awareness of the importance, the zeal to explore all ends of a business endeavor, the love for high returns of investments, the return on investments, and all of that, investors are only going to keep getting more interested in exploring intellectual property rights. And so I think it's going to continue to grow, to evolve, to become even more important. And then you asked how startup founders and investors can be more aware of the role of intellectual property rights. I think that the first point of this is by education. They should educate themselves and they should engage in the IP conversation. They should also engage professionals for further education because there is only very little you might know by yourself. They should also take the further steps of conducting IP audits and building protection strategies. These are things that founders and investors can do. They should attend IP-focused conferences and workshops so that they can understand really what this concept of intellectual property is and how best they can explore it. They can take online courses and webinars. There are so many of these on the internet. They should focus on intellectual property publications and blogs. I think so many people are starting to write about these things now. They can educate themselves from there. They should engage the services of IP professionals, organizations, and they should join networks like these that are already more knowledgeable so that they can have more information on this so that they can become more aware of the roles that intellectual property can play in their growth, both as a founder and then in the decision to invest as an investor.
Thank you so much, Precious, for making the time out of your busy schedule to discuss with us today. We are glad to receive from your wealth of knowledge on today's matter of discussion. We'd also
Thank
like to
you.
say a very big thank you to our listeners for tuning in. As always, the conversation continues on our social media handles. Do remember to send us your comments and thoughts on today's episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is brought to you by DealHQ Partners. To find out more about our services, visit www.dealhqpartners.com. See you on the next episode.